Hey there, welcome to Unit 4, Lecture 2. We're going to be looking at the brain and some of the cranial nerves. Our task list for this lecture, of course, you got to take some notes on it, and there's homework. Like I said in the last lecture, there's a lot of homework, so make sure you're doing this as you go through. There is a exercise in Unit 11 of your book, and it's basically testing out the cranial nerves. A lot of these things you might not be able to do at home, like if you don't have a tuning fork or stuff like that. However, you can figure out what cranial nerve is being tested. So just go ahead and answer those questions based on what you already know. And then there is a Unit 4 Quiz 2. So we are going to be taking a look at the brain. Notice that there are 4 things that are labeled. So the cerebrum, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the cerebellum. So what is the most superficial part of the brain? Yeah, it is the cerebrum. Your cerebrum is the bulk of your brain. It is the most superficial part of it. It is like what you would typically think of when you think of a brain is the cerebrum. And where do we find the cerebellum? You can see that over there to the right. We find that cerebellum in the back of the brain. It's in that occipital region of our body. Continuing to look at this, what part of the vertebrae would the spinal cord insert into? I know this is reaching a little bit back. This is reaching back to bones, but remember there is a hole in our vertebra, and that was called the vertebral foramen, right? The vertebral foramen is what the spinal cord actually inserts into so that we don't just crush our spinal cord. If you're into labeling, it's on Unit 11 of your workbook, or if you have the actual workbook, it's on page 267. You can go ahead and start labeling. And so here is the brain from a different perspective. Here, essentially what you're looking at is if someone was looking straight at you. Because if someone's looking straight at you, that's what you would see in terms of their brain. So looking at A, what does A represent? Yep, that most superficial part of the brain, that is your cerebrum. What would B represent? That is your brainstem, and we'll talk more about your brainstem just a little bit here. And what does C represent? Good, it represents your spinal cord, right? That inserts right into the vertebral foramen of our spine or of our vertebra. What is going to separate our cerebrum into right and left hemispheres? You can see at top you have this line going down that's showing that it can split into right and left hemispheres. That is called the longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure is going to split our cerebrum into right and left hemispheres. We do have lobes of the cerebrum, and this is super duper hard. I don't know if we'll be able to handle it here. So we have 4 different lobes of the cerebrum. They are frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal. Hopefully you're like, of course they're frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal. Hopefully it reminds you of the bones and of the muscles as well. So what would lobe A be? Good, that is the frontal lobe. What would B be? Yep, parietal. C. Good, temporal. And D would be occipital. We know this based on the location, based on what we already know about bones, based on what we know about regional terms. We also have these things called gyrus and sulcus. We can also call them gyri and sulci. That's plural versions of those. So we have a gyrus and a sulcus. They mean very basic things. So sulcus is going to mean a kind of a groove. And gyrus is a ridge. I always like to say that a sulcus sucks in. So sulcus sucks in, and a gyrus juts out. So a sulcus sucks in and a gyrus juts out. We can see some different gyri and sulci here. So we see the precentral gyrus, we have a postcentral gyrus, We have a central sulcus and a lateral sulcus. Really what we're looking at here are things that are going in and things that are jutting out. So your precentral gyrus is going to come before your central sulcus, and your postcentral gyrus is going to come after your central sulcus. Hopefully those make sense, and like the terms make sense as well. So now what we've done is we've taken the brain and we've actually made a frontal section of it. So we've made an anterior and a posterior side. So if you look at the picture up here, it shows you how we've cut the brain. So we've cut it in that frontal section. And now we can see we have A, B, C, D, and E. What would A be? Yep, that is that longitudinal fissure, right? The longitudinal fissure which separates our brain into right and left hemispheres. What is B? Is it a sulcus or a gyrus? Well, it's jutting out, right? It's jutting out, therefore it is a gyrus. And what is C? Is it a sulcus or a gyrus? Well, it's sucking in, therefore that is a sulcus. We do have D and E here. They can either be gray or white matter. Which one would be gray matter, D or E? Yeah, D is going to be gray matter, which makes E white matter. We'll talk more about gray and white matter in another lecture. All right, looking at some internal brain structures here, we have the corpus callosum, we have a lateral ventricle, and we have the pineal gland or the pineal gland. So our corpus callosum, it means tough body. What it does is it unites the cerebral hemispheres of the brain. Your brain is not split into a left and a right side. It's actually connected through the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum connects it together. I always say that the corpus callosum calls the two hemispheres of the brain together because it has the word call in it, right? The corpus callosum calls the two halves of the brain together. Looking here, we see that there's a gland. So what gland is found most proximal to the cerebellum? Yep, the pineal gland is found most proximal to our cerebellum. It is important for helping us sleep, which we will get to when we get to that endocrine chapter, which isn't too far away. All right, more brain structures. We have A through D on this slide. We have the diencephalon, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the thalamus. So looking at A, notice that A encompasses two things. Which word over here to the right would represent A? Well, there's two parts to it, so it's got to be the diencephalon. Di means two, so we have a diencephalon here. What would B represent? Yeah, B is going to be our thalamus, all right? So B is our thalamus. And thinking about what we would find underneath our thalamus here. So what would we find underneath the thalamus? Good, the hypothalamus, right? Hypo means under. So under the thalamus, we would find the hypothalamus, which leaves D to be our pituitary gland. And our pituitary gland, if you remember, will sit on a little structure that the sphenoid had, right? So the pituitary gland actually sits on that sella turcica of our sphenoid bone. We also have a word here called the infundibulum. Essentially, the infundibulum connects our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland. So the infundibulum connects our hypothalamus to our pituitary gland. Okay, continuing to look at a couple more structures here and reviewing at the same time. So what does A represent? Yeah, that is our cerebellum. And what does B represent? Good, that is our spinal cord. So you can see that we have the brain stem here. Our brain stem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So we can see that there. Your brain stem is just like the stem of a flower. Okay, that's pretty much what it is. It's a stem that your brain grows upon, essentially. So what does our brain stem include? I just told you, right? It contains the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. I always think that it's like a very sophisticated structure of the body, like some like people in like a castle who like sipping wine and everything. They're all like, hey, what about our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata? All right, anyways, what is the most superior portion of our brainstem? Yeah, it is the midbrain. The midbrain is the most superior. That is like the closest to our actual brain structures. And what is the most inferior portion of our brainstem? Yeah, that is the medulla oblongata, like the classiest name. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior portion of the brainstem. We also have this thing called the arbor vitae. The arbor vitae sounds a whole lot like an arborvitae. If you've ever heard of an arborvitae, it is a plant. So hopefully that makes sense as to why it's called that. But what structure is the arborvitae a part of? Yeah, it's a part of the cerebellum. We call it the arbor vitae because it looks like a branching plant, right? So it looks like a branching plant or a branching tree. If you've ever heard of Arbor Day, you plant a tree, all right? That's what arbor is all about. So it looks like a branching tree, and that is why we call it that. We also have these structures in our brain called ventricles. What ventricles are essentially spaces in our brain, and they carry around cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so those are what ventricles are. They're spaces in our brain that carry around cerebral spinal fluid. What are the names of our ventricles? Good. So we have the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Why do you think we don't have a second ventricle? Yeah, because we actually have two lateral ventricles, which makes sense. We have two lateral ventricles on either side of our brain. So those are one and two. So then we have a third and we have a fourth ventricle. It used to drive me crazy when I was learning about the ventricles and I was like, why is there no second ventricle? Well, that is why. We can continuing to look at here, we can find a couple more parts to the ventricles. We actually have a cerebral aqueduct and we have a central canal. So in what structure of the CNS do we find the central canal? Well, the CNS is our central nervous system, so we find the central canal within our spinal cord. We can see that our cerebral aqueduct is connecting two different ventricles. What two ventricles are connected by the cerebral aqueduct? Good, it is the third and the fourth ventricle. An aqueduct is basically a connection point between two spots. Like an aqueduct, even now, an aqueduct is bringing water from one place to another place. So if a cerebral aqueduct is just bringing cerebral spinal fluid from one place to the next place. Also, I always think it's funny that the third ventricle looks like a chicken head. All right, we are now moving on to the meninges. Our meninges, if you've ever heard of meningitis, that is inflammation of these meninges. So essentially what we're looking at here is you have your skin first. So here's your skin, and then you have a little layer of like tendony stuff, and then you have bone, and then you have the meninges. So we have quite a protective layer in between our skin and our meninges. Our meninges include the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. So looking there, we have the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. What part of the meninges is most proximal to the gray matter of the brain? Well, our gray matter is this stuff right here. So this area here, we talked about that a little earlier in this lecture. So this is the gray matter. The part of the meninges that is most proximal is that pia mater. Okay, so the pia mater is most proximal to the gray matter of the brain, which is nice, right? Pia and proximal, pia and proximal. And what part of the meninges is the most distal to the gray matter of the brain? Well, the one that's furthest away is the dura mater. So the dura mater is most distal to the actual brain structure. Continuing to look at the meninges a little bit, we also have this stuff called the arachnoid matter. So we can see the arachnoid matter. It's kind of in between our dura mater and our pia mater. What do we find, or where do we find that arachnoid matter? You're like, you just told me. Yes, I did. So we find it in between our dura mater and our pia mater. So it is just deep to our dura mater. Okay, it's just deep to it. And what do we find just deep to the arachnoid matter? Well, we can see it over here. So it's this stuff here. We find the subarachnoid space. So looking at the arachnoid matter, underneath it, we have this stuff called the subarachnoid space. What that means, sub, under, arachnoid space. So under the arachnoid is where we would find this. We do call this an arachnoid matter, an arachnoid space, because if you look at it, it looks like a little spider web. So we have little spider webs hanging out in our meninges. Continuing to look at these, because I really want you guys to get these down. What do A, B, and C represent? Well, A is our dura mater, B is our arachnoid matter, and C is our pia mater. So it goes dura, arachnoid, and then pia. Notice that we have this thing called the falx cerebri. So this right here, the falx cerebri. What is that a part of? What structure is the falx cerebri a part of? Yeah, it is part of that longitudinal fissure, and so it's going to help split the brain. So remember that we have that longitudinal fissure that's going to help split the brain, and that corpus callosum, which is going to keep the brain together. We also have this thing called the falx cerebelli. So the falx cerebelli, where would we find that, and what would it do? Well, cerebelli sounds a whole lot like the cerebellum, and the falx cerebri split the brain, so the falx cerebelli would split the cerebellum. So it's in the middle of the cerebellum, and it's going to go ahead and split it. So now we're going to talk about the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid and our sinuses that are in our brain. So a sinus is essentially a vein. Okay, so a sinus is essentially a vein. It's going to be allowing for the passage of nutrients and things like that from the vein into the cerebral spinal fluid, and from the cerebral spinal fluid into that vein. Okay, so when we look at the superior sagittal sinus up at the top, we call it the superior sagittal sinus because it is the way that it runs. Superior, it's on top. Sagittal, along that sagittal plane, vein. So that is where we find that. Notice that we have choroid plexuses, and we have 4 places in which we find the choroid plexuses. We actually find these within the 4 ventricles. Okay, so your lateral ventricles have them, your third and your fourth ventricle all have a choroid plexus. Choroid plexus contains ependymal cells that produce that CSF, that produce that fluid. Notice that we have some arachnoid granulations. Looking at those, what do the arachnoid granulations protrude into? Yeah, they protrude into the superior sagittal sinus, where we can actually be exchanging some of those nutrients and some of those fluids between the veins and the cerebrospinal fluid. So this is the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through your brain. So it starts out at the choroid plexuses, goes to the ventricles, to the subarachnoid space, to the arachnoid granulations, to the venous sinuses. So that's just a flow of CSF, how it goes through the brain. You can remember the flow as CV save. So if you can remember it as CV save, that is the flow of our cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so now we are looking at the cranial nerves. This slide is set up so in the top left-hand corner, you see CN1. CN stands for cranial nerve, and it's number 1. Now we have some choices for the nerve here. Down in the bottom right are things to kind of help you understand what that cranial nerve does. Now in the middle here, you see a picture of the brain that's flipped over, and you're going to see them get labeled. Don't worry about this. You do not have to label the cranial nerves based off of this picture, okay? So you're not going to have to label them. What you really need to know about the cranial nerves is their number, their name, and what they do. So the cranial nerves, their number, their name, and what they do. You will have there is a little, I can't think of the name. There's like a little worksheet that's on Boodle with a key to kind of help you learn these and get them down. All right, so this first one here, it's cranial nerve number 1, is for the sense, see the pennies down there? So the sense of smell. So the sense of smell is actually our olfactory nerve. So cranial nerve number 1 is our olfactory nerve. We talked about olfactory in the past, right? When we talked about that ethmoid bone, we had the olfactory foramina. So this is olfactory. I always remember that our cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory because old factories smell. All right, so olfactory smell, therefore, we have our olfactory nerve helping us being able to smell. So it's for our sense of smell. The bone that's associated with smell was that ethmoid bone, right? The ethmoid bone, because remember, ew, something smells, an ethmoid. So that is the bone that's associated with this. Now, I remember that olfactory nerve is number 1 because you can always smell something before you see it, right? You can always smell it before you see it. You've all had this experience where you definitely smell something cooking before you see it, or you smell something super gross on the road before you see it. So cranial nerve number 1 is our olfactory nerve. We're now looking at cranial nerve number 2. Cranial nerve number 2 is for the sense of sight. So I want you to look at your choices for B and determine what you think our sense of sight would be. Yeah, it's optic, right? So our cranial nerve number 2 is our optic nerve. Our optic nerve helps us with the sense of sight. Now we have a little, there's a couple more that relate to your eyes, but this one is directly for the sense of sight. Now I remember this is number 2 because like I said in the last slide, you smell something, so cranial nerve number 1, before you see it, cranial nerve number 2. What bone was associated with sight? Yeah, it was that sphenoid bone, right? So our sphenoid, that butterfly-shaped bone, was going to help us with sight. Cranial nerve number 3 is there for helping us move our eyeball. It helps move our pupil, and it helps move our lens. We'll talk about our lens when we get to the senses, which will be here shortly. So movement of the eyeball, pupil, and lens. I'm going to give you a hint. It starts with an O. So which one do you think cranial nerve number 3 is? Good. That is our ocular motor. So ocular relates to your eyes. Motor relates to movement. So ocular motor means movement of the eye. So if you can remember movement of the eye, ocular motor, that is cranial nerve number 3. Now to help you with these first 3, I always say it's 3 O's in a row. So if you can remember 3 O's in a row, the first 3 are olfactory, optic, and then ocular motor. All right, we are now on to cranial nerve number 4, which has to do with moving the eyeball. So it has to do with moving the eyeball. Cranial nerve number 4 is either trigeminal or trochlear. Okay, so looking at those words there, trigeminal or trochlear, which one do you think would help move the eye? Good, it is trochlear. So trochlear, I remember that has to do with movement of the eye because it has the word clear in it, if you were to take away the H. And you remember clear eyes, right? So you remember clear eyes and trochlear, it has to do with the eyes. So we can remember the first three O's in a row, right? We have olfactory, optic, then ocular motor, and now we have trochlear for number 4. Cranial nerve number 5 is the other T. The other T is going to be our trigeminal nerve here. So number 5 is a trigeminal. Your trigeminal nerve helps you chew. So just like this llama down here is chewing away, your trigeminal nerve helps you chew. I remember this because you typically eat 3 times in a day, right? So Try means 3. So if you eat 3 times a day, you chew your food 3 times a day. So if you can remember 3 O's in a row and then 2 T's, right? So 2 T's. So 3 O's in a row, then 2 T's. Now we're going to move on to the cranial nerve number 6. From here on, we're going to try to remember these based on their number and their function. So ways of remembering these gets kind of weird, but I promise that it's only there to help you. All right, cranial nerve number 6 helps move the eyeball medially and laterally. So if you're when the doctor has you follow a pen, they are testing this nerve. This is going to be your abducens nerve. So your abducens is movement of your eyeball medially and laterally. You can remember this if you think of abduction, right? Abduction is moving away from your body. So you can move your eyeballs towards your lateral and your medial side. So that's what your abducens does. I remember that abducens is number 6 because you have 6 ab muscles. Right? A 6-pack. Think of a 6-pack and think of your abs. So that is your abducens. Moving of your eyeball medially and laterally is going to be number 6. Number 7 is sensory to the face. All right. So if it's sensory to the face, things like taste, you can feel things that are happening to your face as well. So which one do you think would be sensory to the face? Good, facial, right? So number 7 is your facial nerve. Now I remember this because just hang in there with me, guys. I remember this because I'm like, oh, your face is a 7 out of 7. I don't know. Anyways, so facial 7, or you can be like, oh, my facial's at 7 o'clock today. Yeah, go ahead and move up. All right, we are now on to number 8, but I'm going to do a quick review of 1 through 7. So remember, we have 3 O's in a row at the beginning, right, with cranial nerve 1, 2, and 3. So cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory, helping us smell. Number 2 is optic, helping us see. Number 3 is ocular motor, which is helping us move like the pupil and the lens and the eyeball. Then we have 2 T's, right? So there are 2 T's. Number 4 is trochlear, and it has to do with the eyes, right? That clear part, so the eyes. Number 5 is trigeminal, and since we eat 3 times a day, we have to chew 3 times a day. Then we have number 6. Number 6 is abducens, helping us move our eyes medially and laterally. And number 7 is facial, which is helping us have senses to our face. So now we are looking at number 8. Number 8 has to do with hearing and balance. So number 8 is vestibular cochlear. Vestibular and cochlear, those are all words that we would see in our ears, which have to do with hearing and balance. So if you've ever heard of a cochlear implant is there to help someone hear because it goes right onto the cochlea. Vestibular has to do with balance. So if you have vertigo and things like that, balance isn't the easiest thing to do. So I remember that number 8 is vestibular cochlear because of V8 juice, right? So V8 juice and vestibular cochlear because number 8 is vestibular cochlear. All right, number 9 has to do with your tongue and your throat. So overall, what we're looking at here is like a little bit of movement, a little bit of taste of your tongue and your throat. Now, this one is slightly inappropriate, so I apologize in advance, but it's not too horrible, I don't think. So number 9 is your glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, so that is our glossopharyngeal. Glosso means tongue. Pharyngeal means throat. Okay, so tongue and throat. That's what glossal and pharyngeal mean. So I always think of there's this thing that you do with someone you love that has to do with your tongue and your throat, and it ends with a 9. So if you can remember that, you can remember cranial nerve number 9 is your glossopharyngeal. All right, number 10, you can see down there to the left that it's Las Vegas. So what do you think number 10 is? It is the vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve wanders outside the head and the neck. It has a lot of functions. So if you can remember, if you're going to Vegas, you're wandering, right? You're wandering around. So vagus is number 10. I don't really have a great way of remembering this except for like 10 out of 10, if you go to Vegas, you're coming back with less money. So that's number 10 here. All right, we are on to our almost last one here. So we're almost the last one. We have 12 total. So we're on cranial nerve number 11. Cranial nerve number 11 is going to be our accessory nerve. Your accessory nerve is going to help you like move your head back and forth. Okay, so back and forth with your head. Your muscles that are affected by your accessory nerve are going to be like your trapezius would be the main one. So your trapezius would be the main one. So looking at number 11 and that it's the accessory nerve, I always remember that 11 is accessory because there are 2 1s in 11, and we have 2 C's and 2 S's in accessory. I also remember that your accessory nerve helps you like move your shoulders and shrug your shoulders and things like that. Because a scarf is an accessory. So if you wear a scarf around your shoulders, you can remember that that's an accessory, and your accessory nerve helps move your shoulders. Now we're on to the very last cranial nerve here, number 12. Number 12 is our hypoglossal nerve. We can remember this. It's just movement of the tongue. It's not taste of the tongue. We know that glossal relates to the tongue. So this is just movement of the tongue. I really like that picture of that goat. I think it's a goat. I'm going crazy. By the time I get to number 12, I run out of good ways of remembering things. So glossal just means tongue, and if you can remember that, that's great. So really quick overview. Number 1 is olfactory. Number 2 is optic. Number 3 is ocular motor. Number 4 is trochlear. Number 5 is trigeminal. Number 6 is abducens. Number 7 is facial. Number 8 is vestibular cochlear. Number 9 is glossopharyngeal. Number 10 is vagus. Number 11 is accessory. And number 12 is hypoglossal. Again, there's a worksheet that you can work through and use to help you learn these things. Please make sure that you are trying to learn it and that you're not just looking things up, because these tests are not like super easy. So make sure that you are learning the information rather than waiting till the very last minute and just looking everything up. All right, we made it to the end of this lecture, so we have some homework for you to get started. There's a to help you understand activity here, as well as the worksheets that you can use. And then there is the related quiz, which is the unit for quiz 2. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will talk to you next lecture.